Hello, everybody. So I'm here today talking to Jeannie Walters. Jeannie, I absolutely love your TED Talk, your work, the impact that you make on the world. Oh, just thanks for being here with me. And I just want to start by just welcoming you to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Say. And I feel likewise about you. You have a wonderful energy that you bring to the world, and I've had the pleasure of working with you, and you do a great job too. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Well, today we are going to be talking about, I think, a both sometimes sensitive, always relevant, very sometimes confusing topic, which is diversity and representation, something that's very close to my heart. But before we get into that and kind of how that interacts with the CX world in which you are an expert, first, I'm curious, what would you say your superpower is?
I think my superpower is seeing those small moments that make a big difference and then doing something about them. So helping people have better days through small moments of magic and avoiding those moments that can ruin somebody's day.
So power. I love it. I love it. And why does the world need this? Why does the world need what you do?
Well, I really believe, I mean, the mission of my company is to create fewer ruined days for customers. And the reason I'm so passionate about that is because customers are all of us. We are all in this world where we are human beings. We are juggling families and jobs and priorities and, this year especially so many other things. And
Yeah.
if we go in and they get our coffee order wrong, or if we get a bill that we have to keep calling month after month and saying, there's this charge you told me was gone, that can ruin somebody's day. And then we bring that negative energy into the world. We bring that back to our families. And it's really, I really believe that this is important work because
Hmm.
we spend so much of our time as customers that the best we can do as customer experience professionals is to really think about it, is to really make sure that we are advocating for people who happen to be customers.
Oh, yes, absolutely. As someone, who has been on both sides of the counter, so to speak, in many ways. I mean, I, like
Mhm.
everyone listening to this, I am a customer, a consumer in various forms every single day. I've also worked quite directly in customer service from the like person to person level all the way up to, leading a
Mhm.
large organization, or a large by my standards, at least. And I think that it's really easy to sometimes overlook the people aspect of this. I know as a customer, there are
Mhm.
some organizations that I am just thrilled to engage with. I'm thrilled to give my money to, I'm thrilled to give my time to, and others where I feel almost, yeah, like gross interacting with them, or I have an interaction with them that just tears me down and I feel
Mhm.
totally unheard. And these are the building blocks of how we spend our time day to day, essentially. And the difference between true, I don't know, like the raving fan
Mhm.
thing we always hear about, and just actively being disinterested in engaging with an organization again.
Yeah. Yeah, you're very right. And I think there are so many ways that organizations have relied on data and forgotten that the data is connected to real people. Those
Mm.
numbers actually represent people. And it's easy to say to yourself, well, we've got an 80% satisfaction rate. We're doing great. But if you look closer at the 20% who are dissatisfied, why are they dissatisfied? Well, it's because of exactly what you're talking about. I love that you said feeling unheard, because
Mm.
sometimes it's not a big, like something went terribly wrong. It's just that feeling of neglect, of being ignored, of being uncared for, that can drive somebody away from an organization.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that this is a pretty good segue into the idea of diversity and representation. So I'm curious, what are some of the kind of representation issues that you've seen in the CX
Mhm.
world, and is it something you've kind of always been aware of, or as you talk about, the group of people that feel unheard, or
Mhm.
where does that group of people feeling unheard kind of overlap with some of the diversity and representation challenges?
Sure. Well, this is such a big, huge topic, right? And I think
Absolutely.
I think my own awareness level, I will admit, has grown tremendously in the last, 5 years, especially, and especially
Mm.
even within this last year, because I think it was really easy to think, well, we've got, diversity in the organization, and so we're good. But what we weren't talking about, and I think this is where customer experience really has to have a harder conversation about this is how can we design experiences for everybody if we don't really have everybody in that process, if we don't have
Mm,
people represented who can tell us, you know what, this is not what it's like for me. And let me tell you why. There was a big movement in the last 10 to 20 years around making things more accessible for customers with disabilities. And
mhm.
this is an ongoing conversation as well. But I've been very impressed with some of the brands who have really embraced this idea to the point where they've created special prototypes and invited customers in. And one of the ones that I've talked about before is Comcast. They do this thing where they have a room in their headquarters and they invite customers in who have disabilities, who are visually impaired or things like that. And they say, what is it like to use this remote? Like, we designed this remote for you, this voice act. What is it like for you? How can we make this better? What do you need? Do you need another keyboard? All of these things. And I think that's the direction we have to start going in, like, a broader context. But these are hard conversations. And if
Yeah.
the people in charge don't have an awareness about it, then how can we even get the conversation started? So I think that's where I've really started exploring this idea of how can we invite these stories in? Because, you know, we've heard stories of how people are treated very differently when they walk into stores, right? Like, we've heard about how when they call customer service lines, they get treated very differently or told certain things based on bias and all of these things. So that's the part that I think we can make rules about it, but we also have to look at if we don't have the right representation designing these experiences, then it's really hard to get them right.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And now this kind of leads me to go deeper a little bit down the rabbit hole. And I know this is something I know I could talk about for a really long time. So I hear a lot, I think this year for a lot of people, there's been an awakening. Even myself, as someone who's both Indigenous and a person of color, it's been a bit of an awakening this year.
Mhm.
Kind of coming to terms with the fact that although I haven't had the depth of dangerous and problematic experiences that many people across North America have faced, I have also had a lot of even micro interactions
Mhm.
that were anything from meh to downright alienating that I spent a lot of time and energy just kind of like moving past and glossing over. And I think as this awareness has kind of grown and the momentum for change has grown, one of the main questions that's come up for me is deeply tied to what you're bringing up, which is how much do we, or how do we balance essentially hearing from diverse voices without putting the burden of
Mhm.
change on the people who are already having to do that extra work? So I'm curious for you, just your perspective
Mhm.
on I guess how to draw that balance, especially for professionals, people who are looking now. You talk to CX professionals specifically. We're talking to leaders, maybe just looking to improve the CX of their organization. Can
Mhm.
you just share your thoughts on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I wish I had a magic wand here, right? Because these are tough things, but I think
Yeah.
the approach that customer experience professionals bring and the approach that I've always been really passionate about is you need to look from the outside in. You need to make sure that
Mm,
you are doing everything you can to really understand the experience. But one of the things I say in every workshop I do is we will never be in their brain, right? Like, I can
mm,
only see out of my two eyes. It's literally impossible. So these people who say, oh, you just walk in their shoes and figure it out. We can get to a certain point with that and we
mhm,
can practice empathy and understanding to make sure that we at least attempt to understand. But something like a customer journey map, you take the feedback that they have provided, you look at all your data, but then you always invite customers into that room and you say, tell us how we did. And I think
mm,
that's a great example of
mm,
inclusion that we sometimes don't embrace when we're talking
yeah.
about these diversity and inclusion perspectives. And to your point about the micro interactions, one of the things, and this is the journey of awareness that we're all going through. I think for years, I kind of accepted that there were certain things that people did to get jobs, to be part of the team. And one of those things sometimes is changing their name, right? Just to get an interview, just to get an interview. And so when you look at something LinkedIn did recently, they started providing a pronunciation opportunity. So
Mm.
if you go to somebody's profile, you can
Whew.
hear them say their name. It's such a small thing and it matters so much. And that's
Oh
one of
my
those things,
gosh.
right?
Oh my gosh. Like Jeannie, like say my name. Like that's not
Yeah.
my name is Sayata. Sayata. And
Yeah.
literally the whole I don't go, I never went by say in my personal life before I started this business. I literally just made that exact decision. And to me, and this is once again the push and pull, because to me, I was
Yeah.
like, well, this is a logical decision in order to help people pronounce
Yes.
be able to pronounce, it's kind of a pun. I talk a lot, say, etc. Say it online. There's lots of opportunities there. But
Yeah.
the fact is that even of all the nicknames I've had in my life, like that was picked basically as a strategic decision, knowing that partially I wanted to get I guess the respect and simplicity of not
Mm-hmm.
having people struggle with my name, painful, but
Mm-hmm.
also I didn't want the pain of having
Yeah.
to navigate how to pronounce my name,
Yep.
which is phonetic. Even my parents
Right.
changed the original spelling to make it phonetic,
Yeah.
just on a day-to-day basis. So even you bringing that up, I'm like, oh my God, LinkedIn did what?
Yeah, you should see if it's, because I think they're rolling it out. So I'm not sure if it's
Mm,
available everywhere yet, but and even for me, like I get called Janine or Jenny a lot because people just don't take the time. And I know
mm,
what that, like, there's always that little cringy thing of like, oh, it's not my name. You're not getting it right. And I think that's nothing compared to what other people have had to deal with. And the fact that it never occurred to me that like I had to do something about that, right? And there are people
mm.
who literally, just like we're talking about, they had to take that burden on and change that for everybody else. And so I think when we look at customer experience, we should really turn up our radar about things like
Mm.
that. Like, how can we help customer service agents make sure they get pronunciation right
Yeah,
without?
because I'll tell you that I don't expect that, but if
Yep.
somebody, because in my personal life I still go by Sayata most of the time, if somebody pronounces my name correctly the first time, it stands out. I'm like, woo,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
you know?
Exactly.
Um, yeah, I just want to draw my attention to something that you said, kind of going back to the original question, which is
Hmm.
how can we include diverse voices in our planning without putting the kind of
Hmm.
burden of change on them? And something that you said, which is not just kind of asking people for their stories and gathering the data, although
Hmm.
that is an important part, but also checking in with what you do with that data. Being
Yep.
like, okay, we are the pros, we took this data, we built out the customer journey, this is what we think, and then still inviting like diverse voices into the
Yes.
room to then look at that and be like, okay, how close are we?
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that's even with the work that we do, we often do speak to kind of customers or clients to get their perspectives.
Hmm.
But you're 100% correct, even though uh, we don't bring them back into the room afterwards to be like,
Right.
hey, this is what we heard.
Right.
So even from our perspective, that gives me
Well,
some stuff to think about.
and I'll tell you what, every single client I've ever worked with always says, "Oh, we know our customers. We know them." Right? Like we're like this. And everybody believes that they are connected, that they get it. And then when we start scratching the surface, we start showing them all the ways that they missed it, right? And some of
Mm,
that is if you have, all white men over 65 who are designing this, and your customer base is actually 35-year-old women of color who are, raising kids and juggling all this other stuff. They can't even relate to that. That's not that,
yeah.
like I said, they can only see through their two eyes. So if we are looking for opportunities, we have to really start thinking bigger about who our customers are, because we're making a whole bunch of assumptions sometimes about their journey being close to my journey.
Yeah.
And that's where we can get ourselves into real trouble, because I think we've seen this over and over in a lot of different ways in history, but also in politics, in all of these different ways where leaders are standing up representing people who are not anything like them, and they're not taking the effort to really get to know them, to find out what is your experience like, and listen in a way of, I mean, I also say about customer experience, you have to bring this incredible humility, because every
Mm,
time you listen, you have to think, I know nothing, right? Like anything you tell me is knowledge that I don't have. And
yeah.
so it's like this whole mindset shift that expertise is really about naivete in some ways, and just saying, I don't know any of this. You're the expert. You have to tell me. And then doing something with that and making sure you turn those insights into actions, and then continually check in and make sure that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's so powerful. It falls into the category of what I like to call simple, but not easy.
Yeah, that's
Like,
a
you can
great
break
way
it
to say
down
it.
simply, but it is not easy.
Hmm.
And just speaking to what you just said about humility, how there's a humility here. I think one of the things that's become the most resonant for me in the last few months in particular is the gap between what we think we know and what we know that we don't know.
Mm. Yeah.
And what I'm really hearing from you, and even in your own story, in your own perspective, is that in order to be able to make the appropriate shifts, you have to move away from what you think you know and embrace that what you know that you don't know, so to
Yep.
speak. And so I'm curious, what are some of the ways in the last, year, 5 years,
Hmm.
as you've become kind of your awareness has been rising of these issues? What are some of the things that you do to kind of check yourself to see if you're
Hmm.
considering diverse experiences?
Hmm. I love this question. And you're saying that, and I'm like, oh, I've got to get better at this. You're right. But I think one little trick that I've had, and this was actually from an experience with a woman who has trouble speaking. She has a disability. And she was saying that one of the things that drives her crazy is that a lot of customer experiences don't honor her request to go off of voice. They don't
Mm,
on they say, you've got to call in, you've got to talk to somebody. And she says, this is going to be frustrating for both of us. Um, and then she's treated a certain way because they're assuming that she's not intelligent. They're
difficult or
assuming all these
something.
things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And when she said that, I was like, that's such an interesting thing, because you think about a lot of the biases that people have, and those come out in the five senses in a way, right? Like,
Mm,
what are we seeing and how are we processing that? What are we hearing? Are we hearing an accent we're unfamiliar with? What does that do to our brain? Like, how do we translate all this stuff? So I kind of do this like five senses check where I think, what is happening easily for most people that could be an obstacle for others? So,
mm,
for instance, and I think what we've been going through in the States and throughout everywhere lately, but I think there's so much awareness about the fact that, my experience as a Caucasian woman is totally different than somebody who is a person of color. And I can, I can, empathize with that, but I can't understand it. I can't have that experience. So the best I can do is think about, what are those barriers that somebody might run into that I wouldn't necessarily run into, that most
mm,
people in our customer group, even maybe they wouldn't, maybe our leaders wouldn't. But what are those kind of barriers with, sight, with ears, with all these things, because that can actually help us connect with the experience in a different way. And I think if you think about even things, what's this like for somebody using a wheelchair? What's this like for
yeah.
somebody with a hearing impairment? What's this like for somebody who is new to the country and doesn't speak English? Right. All of
Mm,
these different things. And so I think that's one check. But then again, I can get as far as I can get. And then I need to bring in people who actually have that experience and get their perspectives and check in and try to, let them know that we are trying to get this right. We might not, right? We might not,
yeah.
especially on the first try, but we're trying to get this right. And that means we want to engage and empower voices and make sure that they're heard in a different way than they have been in the past.
Yeah.
And even saying
Yeah.
all this, like, I feel like, what right do I have to say all this? Because I know my experience is so different. And I think that's the conversation that we also need to have, is like, how do we get the right people? And this is the bigger conversation that's happening right now, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of that is about internal, right? Like building teams internally, which is
Yeah.
incredibly important for this conversation as well. I just want to
Mhm.
make sure we continue that conversation to that external too, with the customers and who
Yes.
we're interacting with.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. Oh, there's just so much there. I'm like, oh, where to begin? um, yeah, I love that framework that you just described, which is basically running an experience. It's like, how do we put ourselves in the shoes, so to speak, of someone else? As you put it,
Mhm.
you can empathize with someone, you can maybe relate it to experiences you've had that were similarly painful, could never understand what it's like to be them. This actually
Mm-hmm.
reversed for me for a lot of life, because I grew up as a kid in a very diverse community and a very diverse classroom. And then I moved to a very rural area that was very homogenous. And I was the only person who was different in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that I've realized is that I was relating my experience sometimes to my friends and peers who grew up with
Mm-hmm.
me in those situations, thinking we were having the same experience. And then it's only in the past year where I might describe my experience with something like my name or something like that, and have the other person be like, actually, I've never had that experience at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it's shown me, again, even as someone who's relatively privileged, just the weight and energy that
Mm-hmm.
navigating those micro interactions can take. But one of the things that has become so clear to me as an adult is when we talk about diversity, right? Like, it's not just about race. It's not just about potentially, disability. It's not just about gender. Like, even just I myself am a person of color, an Indigenous person, I'm queer, I'm neurodivergent. Like, there's so many different forms in which basically I may not fit the norm. But what that's also caused me to see is that although the nature of people perhaps not feeling heard and not fitting in can be different from person to person, the overarching themes and solutions remain the same. And that's what I'm hearing from you as well.
Mm-hmm.
It is that you can use the same framework. It's like, what are my senses experiencing?
Yeah.
How is that different from what this person here in front of me with their particular context might be experiencing? And yeah, that's
Well, and I think you bring up a great point too, because this is why it's such a big topic, right? Diversity and inclusion. Like, what does that mean? It means including everybody. Well, that's a pretty big group. So,
yeah.
so we are going to misstep sometimes, and we are going to make assumptions, or we're going to say, you know what, we're really, we're invested. We're going to hire X number of people of color, and then we forget that conversation about LGBT. Like all of those things can happen at once. And so I think the more that we have these conversations about, what inclusion means, thinking through what are the obstacles or barriers that people could have that would make them feel excluded, that would make them feel like they're not welcome, all of those things. It's really important. And one of the things I've started to adapt in the last couple of years, when we do journey mapping and things like that, we develop personas. And a lot of times they end up with very specific demographics, very specific names. And then what I started noticing was we would talk about Joseph, the engineer or something. And we would have a stock photo of Joseph running a marathon because that's what he likes to do and all these things. And then a few months in, I'd be like, oh my gosh, they think every customer is Joseph. This is a problem. They think every customer is a white engineer who runs marathons. That's not the purpose of a persona. The purpose of a persona is to narrow what, how you are discussing and interacting with this group so that you understand them better.
Yeah, but I describe it as the group that you kind of can't forget about, but they're not everybody.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things I started doing, because I realized there was a gender issue happening too, was now I use initials for their names, because it takes away some of the stuff that goes with gender assigned names.
Yeah.
And so we can talk about them in this kind of more nebulous way. Sometimes we do little like doodles instead of full on photos, because it helps people still connect with who they are inside, but it takes away some of that bias of then, this persona that we're talking to, they're always a guy, right? Like, no, they're not. Or we use names like Alex a lot, or things like that, Sam, so that you can kind of assign to both, and just to get out of our heads a little bit about this stuff.
Yeah. I love that. I love two kind of things that I'm pulling from your answer here. One is checking your bias. It's not checking your bias. I guess maybe three things. One is checking your bias, which is understanding that you may never fully understand, but if you can understand the barriers to someone having basically a positive experience or the same experience that someone else might have without those barriers, then that is a really good place to start, because it becomes less about what particular kind of like group or solution and more about serving the need.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important. The second thing that I'm hearing is that we strive for helping people feel heard rather than perfection. And this is something that I think is just important to highlight, because if you're anything like me and maybe sometimes lean towards perfectionism or overachieving or any of those things,
What?
then people listening to this podcast,
No, never. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. But it's just really important to understand that we are aiming for a moving target here. You're never going to be able to include literally everyone. You're never going to be able to make literally every single person feel heard. And it's important to make sure that you're checking yourself, so to speak, and asking the right questions and helping people, the people you can engage with, feel heard, rather than thinking that you're going to create this perfect customer experience that every single literal person absolutely adores.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And that's just reality.
It's reality. And I think the other thing is not every person is your customer.
Yes.
So
yes.
you will have people who you are serving very intentionally. You'll have other people who kind of get into that orbit, but there will be people who never want to be your customer. And frankly, you don't want them to be your customer. And that's okay, because you can't be all things to all people. And I think that's a lesson we have to learn too. But it's, there are opportunities, I think, everywhere to look at how can we just be more welcoming? How can we make sure we are having the conversations we need to internally around who we hire and how we train them and how we evaluate them and all of these things to make sure that they are delivering on that welcoming experience. But it's not, I think part of why this stuff is hard is because people are like, well, if we start talking about it, then there's a lot we have to do, right? Like it's easier if we can just say like, we got it. We know our customers, they're fine. But if you really dig into it, there's always more to do here. And I think that's why people get a little, shy about jumping in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I get that. I think even for myself, I've had part of the reason why I was so hesitant to even acknowledge being on the receiving end of some of these negative experiences, other than the ones that were extreme, because I have had a few more extreme ones, or even acknowledging a desire for it to be different. That's dangerous, right?
Ooh.
Because as soon as you acknowledge a desire for something to be different, then it's like, well, how are we going to make it different? What can I do to make it different? And that's a huge, huge can of worms.
Wow. That's a really powerful observation. Yeah. And that's a perfect example of something where I'm like, I totally get what you're saying now. I don't think I've ever had that experience myself. And it's so powerful to hear you share that and to understand like that's an experience that I probably haven't had. And so I just appreciate that you're sharing that, because that's the type of thing we need to just keep hearing stories. We need to keep hearing what actual experiences are happening, because otherwise, how can we build that awareness? How can we build that team? How can we build those leaders who are actually going to do something about it? And I get so emotional anyway, but my kids, I've got 2 teenage boys now, 13 and 16, and they are constantly teaching me things. And it's awesome because I feel like I have so much faith in what they're doing right now and how they view the world and how aware they are of different challenges and different opportunities in just this really organic way. And I think that's what's, I always say, like, you're going to have to solve all this, just so you know, like, no pressure, but this is on you. So so thank you for sharing that. Cause those are those things that like help all of us grow.
Another example of something that, I'm just sharing my experience and kind of assume to some degree that it's a bit of a universal experience. One of the things that I'm hearing loud and clear from you, even when you talk about your sons and you talk about kind of these ways to approach things as we look towards the future, is that it's not that there's necessarily like a set of principles that we can create that everyone needs to adhere to, or et cetera. I myself have been working on a few things, including a really, really diversity friendly course on hiring and a few other things. But what I am hearing from you is that it's the process. And I agree with this as well. It's not necessarily the solution. It's, if I can kind of expand on what you're saying perhaps a little bit or interpret it, it's that idea of critical thinking rather than just kind of sitting, driving within the lane that you were raised in, or that is appropriate to your current context, and not really looking even to see, because you're not really aware of those other lanes. It's this idea of nurturing critical thinking and asking more questions, challenging yourself to think more challenging things. And allowing yourself to kind of be creative and problem solve there, and of course to be open to other people's perspectives. And I think
I love the way you said that, and especially because you said process, because you're Canadian, so I love that.
Just wait till I pull out the niche.
But one of the things I say a lot in, especially around the idea of journey mapping, is it's process over product. Because I think sometimes we get really caught up in the deliverable, right? Like this thing that we're doing, it's got to be perfect and it's got to be something that lasts for a long time. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. You can change it any day, because it's the process of having a workshop where I'm kind of getting people to think about what it's like to be a customer when they've never really thought about it. They've relied on process maps, on internal maps. And then you're saying like, really, well, you think that's happening? This is actually what's happening. And you can start seeing people really connect with like, oh my gosh, you know what we could do about that? I've had a situation where in the middle of a workshop, we realized that one group was sending out a welcome package, and then the other group said, wait a minute, we sent out a welcome package. So the customers were getting like all this extra stuff, and it wasn't connected. So they literally in the meeting said, well, we can stop one of those. And they ran out and they like did what they needed to do to stop it. And they came back. And I was like, this is why this is magic. It's not about, that's never going to show up on the journey map now, right? That's not what this is about. It's about thinking through, how can we improve things for everyone? And how can we really keep asking those questions of, okay, great that happens. Why does that happen? That's another one of my favorite questions, because people will look around like, that's just the way it happens. And it's like, why? So I think, that whole idea of process over product is such a powerful way to look at things, because we live in this amazing time with all this amazing technology. We can change things. Like we're not printing things that stay around forever anymore. We can do all this magic, and why not embrace that and say, we can change, we can update, we can make, micro moments a little better and make a big difference in somebody's day. And that's worth it. And so, yeah, I think it's a fun way to look at the world, because nothing's static anymore. Nothing's forever.
Yes, someone that I deeply respected asked me a few weeks ago how I was doing. And I was like, well, it's been a bit of a challenge, and this way, but it's changing. I feel like the challenges I'm experiencing now are not the challenges of a month ago. They're equally hard though. And she said to me, she was like, as long as you're continuing to change and you're not stagnating, there's hope and there's growth.
Oh, love that.
And I'm resonating with that super strongly with what you're saying, which is that, we're never going to be at that destination, but if we can just continually challenge ourselves to keep walking along the path, then we won't get lost or stagnated. We'll be able to find ourselves again. Now, to get a little bit more specific about that, I'm curious, what are some questions that leaders can potentially, some of, you've named a few already, like, why is this way? Or how can we make this better for everyone? I'm curious, what are some other questions that leaders can ask themselves to increase their critical thinking around diverse customer experiences?
Well, one of my big questions for any customer experience is, how do you define success in customer experience? Because it's really easy to say like, we're going to be the best, or we're going to have world-class service. But I really encourage people to think through, what does that actually mean? Because sometimes you can be the fastest, but that doesn't mean you're going to be the most accurate. Like sometimes there are trade-offs you have to decide. So based on your vision and values, what is your customer experience mission? And the more you can define that, then that makes all of those other questions easier, because if you are talking about, let's say, an effortless experience, translating that to a customer with a wheelchair or somebody who has a hard name to pronounce or any of those things, like what are the ways that you can make that truly effortless for everybody? So
Yeah.
getting to that level of detail, I think, is a hugely important thing for all customer experiences. And then as far as the others, I mean, I love that question of like, why is this happening? And in my workshops, I always say, if the answer is it's always been done that way, we need to flip the table. Like we need to just say, that's over. That's a terrible answer.
Yeah.
And, is this living up to the mission? Is it great? And you can drill down and ask that question for like really small moments. Is this living up to our mission? And if you have that well defined, then that's where you connect all those dots and make sure you're really delivering for customers.
Oh, I love that answer. I love that answer so much. Anyone on my team or anyone who has ever worked with me on a consulting basis can tell you that I'm obsessed with specificity, not because I'm obsessed with like pointless little details, but because I hate genericisms, because I find that they're not helpful. Being able to define success in a concrete way, in writing terms, showing rather than telling, instead of saying, yeah, this is going to be great, you're going to love it, where you'll get excellent service. It's like, well, what does that mean?
Right.
And these factors that you described that help constrain that for your business. When I first started my business, I thought that things like vision, mission, and values were these kind of like airy-fairy things that were kind of moving targets, etc. As I get older and the business gets more mature and we hire and fire and make different decisions and create new products, these ideas, these concepts that constrain your business, which I would define mission as the thing you do on the ground every day. Again, what does success look like? Defining what success looks like. We're very specific about ours. We have 3 points. But on the other side of things, your values are constraints. I call them constraints for acceptable behavior.
I like that.
In the sense that they're not just like words, they are concepts that tell you whether a decision or a type of behavior was okay or not okay. And they're different for other people. There's no set of values that are universal to any industry, in my opinion. You talk about in your personas how you kind of give ways for people to understand and empathize and align themselves. We do that through the concept of archetypes with values, where we're like, well, understanding what a word means or doesn't mean, okay, maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. But if we can take these characters that we all understand and why do they behave they do and how do you align with it, we use basically a wheel of archetypes to align people and help them understand what their values are in practical terms.
Love that.
Yeah. I just love that. Okay, so I had this like list of like 10 or 15 questions. I'm gonna be honest. I've asked like 2 of them, and all the other questions I've asked have just come up from the amazing things you're saying.
These are the best conversations though.
Yes, absolutely. My, podcast secret is that I do these interviews secretly just to be able to have really amazing conversations with people that I deeply respect and get their perspectives. So
nice.
All right. But as we do start to wind down a bit, other than caffeine, what would you say gets you up in the morning?
I think, I have always really selfishly loved when I, give things away and get people who say this really helped me. Like that really gets me going. And so now we're doing so much where, especially this year, we kind of really opened up in ways that connected around the globe. And so I do these weekly webinars and, blogs and downloadables and all these different things, and hearing from people like, what, this really helped us define our mission, or this really helped me understand that we had to do more work around inclusion, that we had to do more work around this. That just, gets my engine going, and it makes it worth it on those long days. Right. So yeah.
Yes. I feel that. I perceive that in the last year, we've always been an organization with like values, but in the last year, we've been a lot more of kind of like a mission-driven organization in the sense that we're producing content and teaching people and helping people and like synthesizing and creating. And I
Yes.
so agree with you. Like that feeling of knowing that someone absorbed it and got it and made a change and was inspired. Oh, it's like drugs, but with no horrible come down.
It is. I mean, there's something really special about the way we can connect around the globe right now too. And I think because, the pandemic is by definition global, like it is something that most people are experiencing on some level. That's created this really interesting sense of empathy and compassion that I hope it continues. My hope is that we can carry that with us even once we get through the pandemic and everything else. But that's been really, I think, one of the silver linings of all the terrible things.
Yes. Yes, I feel that. All right. And so amongst the, interesting world situation currently, what is the number one thing that you do to preserve your wellness?
I get out and walk every day in the middle of my day if I can help it. So I start on the treadmill in the morning most days, but there's something about getting fresh air every single day. I get out there with my dog based on their school schedules. Sometimes I drag one of my kids along. And that started very early on during this time when they were home from school. And there's something really motivating for me about knowing that I'm going to break up my day with fresh air, with getting away from screens, and with just, getting out there. And today there was a 20-degree wind chill and we bundled up and still did it. And I'm like, I'm going to keep doing this until, I literally can't. So I think that's something that I have really appreciated, that we live in a walkable community. And I say hi to neighbors, like we have really friendly neighbors, and we live in a very diverse community, which is also really wonderful. So we get to interact in this way that makes me feel like I'm still connected to people as well.
Oh, yes. I relate to that super hard. Walking has been just an absolute lifeline for me. Like you said, something about like I'll do yoga in my living room. It's super relaxing, but something about that fresh air or seeing faces. Sometimes even on like really like rainy or icky days by some people's standards, not seeing faces sometimes is nice too.
Yeah, that's true. Just getting out there. Sometimes I listen to podcasts and go somewhere else. So I think that's something that I've really enjoyed this year.
Excellent. Excellent. Do you have any last words of wisdom that you want someone listening to this right now to walk away with?
Well, I don't know if I have wisdom, but I just, I think it's a year that we have learned to also be really grateful and with what we have. And I know there are a lot of people who have had incredible challenges throughout this year too. And so I really just appreciate that people are still really interested in learning about how to serve people, how to connect with people. And if you're listening to this and if you're applying these things, then you're absolutely one of the good guys. You are dedicating time and effort and everything else to being the kind of leader we need in the world. So thank you for that.
Excellent. And if our listeners want to engage more with you in particular, check out anything you might have, any kind of programs or content or et cetera that you produce, where would they best be able to find you online?
Our website is experienceinvestigators.com. And this year we have a special year where we're giving away a lot of content at yearofcx.com.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thanks again, Jeannie, for coming and talking to me about this. I feel like this episode could have been 3 times as long. I actually had to do a double take and be like, oh crap, what time is it? This was just such a pleasure.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yay. Awesome. And to everyone listening, as always, I hope you have a great day. And I do want to say that diversity can be a tough topic, whether you feel unheard, whether you're part of a group that feels unheard, or whether you are kind of waking up to your own perhaps kind of privilege and looking for ways to help other people feel heard. I just encourage you, find a moment today, take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. We're building this new world together. All right. Take care, guys.